You look at the clock and realize your child should have been asleep a long time ago. But instead of calming down, they get even more hyper. They start running around the house, jumping on the couch, laughing nonstop, talking louder. It almost feels like they suddenly got a second burst of energy. And that's exactly when that confusing thought hits almost every parent. How can someone who's exhausted become more energetic? If they're tired, why do they seem so awake? Are they just fighting sleep? Is this a tantrum? Too much energy? Because from the outside, it genuinely makes no sense. The more tired the child gets, the harder it becomes for them to slow down. And the strangest part is that there's usually a very specific moment when everything shifts. You can see it in their eyes, in the intensity, in the way they suddenly react to the smallest things, as if, out of nowhere, their body flipped into overdrive. But here's the part almost nobody tells you. Most of the time, hyperactivity does not mean a child isn't sleepy. In fact, it can mean the exact opposite. And what you're seeing isn't bad behavior. It isn't extra energy. And it's definitely not a simple choice to stay awake. What you're actually seeing is an exhausted brain trying to keep functioning. And once you understand that, everything about this behavior starts to look completely different. Most explanations stop at the surface. People say the child is wired, that they haven't burned enough energy, that they're stalling bedtime, or that if they were really tired, they'd just fall asleep. But that doesn't explain the pattern. Because almost every overtired child goes through the same shift. First comes the exhaustion, then comes the hyperactivity. And this happens even in children far too young to manipulate or put on a show. So no, this isn't just behavior. This is physiology. In fact, studies in neurodevelopment and emotional regulation, including research discussed by institutions like Harvard University and Yale University, show that in young children, extreme tiredness can activate biological alert systems inside the brain. In other words, the more exhausted the system becomes, the more the brain tries to prevent shutdown. And that's when everything starts making sense, because the child isn't becoming hyper despite being sleepy. They're becoming hyper because of it. And once you understand that, the question completely changes. It's no longer, why won't my child sleep when they're tired? It becomes, what is their brain trying to do when exhaustion starts going too far? To truly understand this, you need to look at something almost nobody notices. A child's brain still doesn't know how to handle exhaustion very well, and that changes everything. Because a young child still can't regulate their internal state in a stable way. The part of the brain responsible for self-regulation and emotional control, the prefrontal cortex, is still developing. Meanwhile, the emotional and alert systems are already operating at full intensity. So, when the body becomes overly tired, the brain enters a conflict because it needs to slow down, but it still doesn't know how to make that transition smoothly on its own. And that's where something powerful happens. When the nervous system detects excessive fatigue, it can increase the release of alert-related hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Yes, adrenaline, but not to give more energy. The brain does this as an attempt to keep functioning, and the effect shows up directly in the behavior. More impulsivity, more movement, stronger emotional reactions, more irritability, more difficulty calming down. That's why many children seem to switch into overdrive right after passing their ideal sleep window. And this isn't just behavior. This is neurology in action. Research on childhood sleep deprivation shows that overtired children often display increased hyperactivity and emotional dysregulation because the brain tries to compensate for exhaustion by increasing activation levels. In other words, hyperactivity doesn't always mean a child isn't tired. Many times, it means the exact opposite. And once you understand that, the entire situation looks different because the child isn't fighting against you. Their brain is fighting against shutting down. And when you look at this from a deeper perspective, everything starts to click. Because the human brain was never designed to simply shut down when it becomes exhausted, especially in early childhood. Throughout evolution, a brain that was too tired, too vulnerable, too disorganized was a brain at risk. And that's why this incredibly contradictory biological mechanism exists. When the nervous system senses it's losing stability, it increases alertness as an automatic attempt to stay functional. Now think about what that means for a small child. They're already exhausted. Their body should be slowing down, but their brain still can't make that transition efficiently on its own. So the system compensates. It increases activation, more movement, more emotional intensity, almost as if the brain is saying, "Keep going. Don't lose control right now." And that creates the exact behavior that seems so contradictory from the outside, but biologically makes perfect sense, because the child isn't becoming hyper despite being tired. They're becoming hyper because their brain is trying to cope with the exhaustion. And that's exactly why so many parents feel like there's a point of no return. In that moment when the child seemed merely tired and suddenly becomes overstimulated, emotionally sensitive, and almost impossible to calm down. Because at that point, the nervous system has stopped regulating and started compensating. And this is where the most important part begins to appear. Because behind all that hyperactivity, there's actually a brain in conflict. On one side, the child's body wants to sleep, but on the other, their brain still can't lower its level of activation on its own. So something strange starts to happen. The more exhausted they become, the more emotionally disorganized they seem. And that's why small things suddenly trigger huge reactions. Noise feels more overwhelming. Frustration escalates faster. Their body seems restless nonstop, not because they're trying to get attention, but because their nervous system has lost stability. And that completely changes the way you interpret that moment, because that child running around the house at 10 p.m. might not be full of energy at all. They might actually be completely exhausted, but their brain still doesn't know how to exit that state by itself. So they keep moving, keep reacting, keep speeding up, almost like an involuntary attempt to stay organized internally. And that explains why, so often, trying to burn off more energy only seems to make things worse. Because the problem isn't too much energy, it's too much activation inside an overtired brain. Once you start seeing it this way, that behavior that once looked like defiance, overreacting, or even bad behavior starts to mean something completely different. It's not manipulation, it's not acting spoiled, and it's definitely not a conscious choice. It's a brain trying to hold itself together, even while overwhelmed. And if that behavior could be translated, it would sound something like this. My body is tired, but I can't slow down by myself. The more exhausted I get, the harder it becomes to stay regulated. I'm not trying to fight you. I'm trying not to lose control of what I'm feeling. And that changes everything, because this isn't about a child who doesn't want to sleep. It's about an immature nervous system trying to handle more exhaustion than it can regulate. And that moment that once looked like pure chaos starts to reveal something much deeper. A developing brain trying to keep functioning even after reaching its limit. Now, there's one detail almost nobody connects, but it probably happens in your house too. A lot of children who get hyper when they're overtired completely change during bath time. Some days their body slows down. They seem calmer, more regulated, but other days, it feels like everything gets worse. More sensitive, more irritable, more restless. And that creates a quiet question in a lot of parents' minds. Why does the bath calm my child down sometimes, but other times make them even more hyper? Because what changes a child's state isn't just sleep, it's the state of their nervous system in that moment. Temperature, physical contact, sensory input, internal levels of activation, all of that can completely change how the brain responds. If this kind of content helps you understand your child differently, subscribe to the channel. Because here, you don't get shallow parenting advice. You learn what's actually happening inside the developing brain, and that changes the way you see every behavior. Now, if you want to understand why bath temperature can sometimes calm a child instantly, and other times make them even more sensitive or overstimulated, click the video on your screen. Because before children can explain what they feel, their nervous system is already telling the whole story.